Well, thanks for making the time to join us on our first webinar around transformational women's leadership, and just also for your willingness to explore this methodology with us as a means to deepen our knowledge around feminism. As you all know, the webinar came as a response to the gap left by our colleagues not being able to go on the Bangladeshi exchange around transformational women's leadership due to political unrest there. But also an opportunity for us to respond to our aspirations that was articulated by some of our workshops and gatherings to just learn more about gender, deepen our knowledge around feminism and power. So yes, so welcome. And we all are going to take this plunge, and the one who will be with us for the 4 series will be Professor Elaine Salo, who's the Director of the Women and Gender Studies at the University of Pretoria. She will be the moderator for our webinars. And to start us off is Desiree Lewis, a professor at the Women and Gender Studies at University of the Western Cape. And she will be talking us through important moments and processes to understand and unravel the complexity of feminism. So over to you, Desiree.
Hi, Denise. And hello, everybody else. I'm going to be talking about feminism in the past and the present, and I'm going to work through a presentation. So just bear with me, people. I hope it's going to... Oh, dear.
Sorry, can I just come in? My apologies.
Is Nick around?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. I just need to give my introduction to allow people to figure out how it's going to work for them. Sorry about that. Okay. It's good day all. My name is Nick. Okay, I'm going to be supplying the tech support for the webinar series. Although I do not foresee any hitches, this whole process is rather new for all of us. So this first webinar will be a bit of a trial by fire. I hope that all here have read through the help sheet I emailed out. I'm going to briefly be going over what you as attendees need to know to participate in this webinar. Please bear in mind that as attendees you're muted, so we cannot hear if you speak into your mics. You will have a toolbar along the top right-hand side of your screen. With this toolbar you can access 2 important things. The first is the raise hand button. If, during the allocated question time, you have a question or wish to make a comment, select this button and it will highlight you to the presenter and the organizers. This function also allows us to monitor the order in which hands were raised, thus allowing us to work through the questions fairly. The second is the option to type in a question. In this webinar, we will only be taking text-based questions and not audio questions. This is to make the process simpler and why all attendees have been muted. When prompted to ask questions, please type in your question, raise your hand, and then submit your question. Ensure that your question is either submitted to all people or is aimed at me, Nicholas Mulver. I will be taking these questions and pasting them onto a Word document that will be shared across screens. This will allow the presenter to engage with the question while also allowing the attendees to see the question being answered. Once a question has been taken, I will lower the person's hand. So if you see your digitally raised hand magically disappearing, that is why. We would really appreciate any positive or critical feedback you have following the conclusion of this webinar. Please send your comments and criticisms to me at nickm, that's N-I-C-M, at Oxfam, oxfam.org.au. Thank you very much. I'm going to now mute myself and hand over to Desiree.
Thanks, Nick. I'm not sure if my presentation can be seen. Hello?
It will now take a second or two.
Okay.
There we go.
Here we go, coming up.
Can you? Oh, good. Okay. Okay. The title of my talk is Feminisms in Africa Then and Now. And rather than giving a fairly mechanical, I suppose, historical overview, I want to highlight some of the salient moments and processes in order to raise questions specifically around what challenges they pose for us now. So I want to deal with, I'm providing, just to start off with, a kind of a roadmap. And basically my argument is that understanding the challenges that we confront now requires us to think about our past. And obviously the various challenges in different African countries differ. The challenges differ also in various countries in the global south, but there are very many similar and related patterns. So the main areas that I want to deal with are, first of all, pre-colonial societies, tradition, and feminism. Secondly, I'll look at feminism and nationalism, as well as anti-racist struggles. And then I'll go on to look at post-colonial and post-apartheid feminisms, especially with a view to identifying some troubling trends there. And then I go on to pose some challenges from my point of view. It might seem a bit strange to start with tradition and pre-colonial societies, but in many ways, tradition and what happened during the pre-colonial period continues to surface in feminist debates in Africa, and it's really important for us to think quite carefully about what we mean by tradition. I think to start off with, it's important to acknowledge that gender relations and identities in Africa before colonialism have been very, very strongly misunderstood and misrepresented. The stereotypical image of the pre-colonial woman is supposed to be a woman who is submissive, conformist, obedient, totally subservient to her man. And the stereotypical representation of African men dwells on their hypermasculinity, their brute strength, and their militarism. It's important to revisit these stereotypes in thinking about feminism in the present for two reasons. First of all, when we start to work through these stereotypes and interrogate them carefully, we can start to think about histories of feminism in much more complicated and realistic ways. Secondly, we can also challenge the idea that some kind of innate and timeless notion of tradition obstructs gender transformation or feminism in Africa, because that's very often the argument about the main challenge facing feminism in Africa. I'm moving on to these two images because they in many ways exemplify the stereotypes that are associated with African men and African women. They are obviously constructed, but both images convey stereotypes about gender and heterosexuality attached to African female and male bodies. The woman is posed as passive, domestic bound. She somehow seems to be close to nature. She's naive. Women are always depicted with children. And very often we see this kind of image surfacing in visual material as well as textual material. And the implication is that African women need to be saved. They do not have any agency of their own. In contrast, men, and this is exemplified in the drawing of Shaka Zulu, are seen as these hyper-virile, hypersexual, hyper-headed warriors. And these are the kinds of constructs that we really need to be very critical of. And of course, most important is that African men and women are seen to be absolutely trapped in unchanging gender roles. And I think this is the crux of the problem, the idea that tradition, African tradition, is something that just does not change. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the main reason for this fixed definition of tradition is that colonialism, and in South Africa apartheid, introduced administrative and knowledge systems. And knowledge systems, of course, included ethnography, anthropology, and of course, in many ways, very sophisticated knowledge systems, which defined pre-colonial societies in ways that suited colonial and apartheid control. The colonized were believed to have rigid and unchanging customs and traditions, especially fixed and backward ideas about gender and sexuality. In contrast, it was believed that colonizing countries, which were open to change and innovation, were at the forefront of modernization. Now, these are the kinds of myths that have been challenged by a number of African writers, African feminists, some of whom self-define as feminists, some of whom don't, especially writers who've dealt with Nigeria. One example is Oyeronke Oyewumi. She's written a book called The Invention of Women. Another example is Ife Amadiume, who's written a number of texts, but probably the best known is Male Daughters and Female Husbands. They, of course, have a great deal to say, but some of their main arguments are, first of all, that gender roles in pre-colonial African society have been dynamic and changing, contrary to the myth that they've been fixed and static and that somehow women need to be kind of violently severed from their anchorage in tradition. The argument is that these roles have always been very dynamic. Second point that's raised is that women in pre-colonial societies often played powerful and active roles as leaders, thinkers, and within households and communities. And of course, the stereotype is that African women have traditionally, in the pre-colonial period, always played subservient roles. A third point that they raise is that gender identities and roles were not necessarily fixed in terms of biological sex, so that women often played male roles and men performed female roles. This is raised especially in Ife Amadiume's book, where she argues that gender was actually very fluid in African contexts, and that it was actually with the introduction of colonialism that the idea of gender being absolutely fixed came into place. A fourth point that they raise, which is really implicit in their investigation, is that the dualism of tradition on one hand as backward and static, and westernization on the other hand and dynamic, ignores the realities of struggles in the North and the South, implicitly criticizing the idea that feminism in the West has all the answers. And of course, they're also implicitly criticizing the idea that westernization automatically means advancement or feminist progress. So why is the debate about tradition, pre-colonial society, and gender important for us in South Africa, in Africa at large, and I think it's in the global South generally? First of all, I think it's important that tradition can be used as a weapon against women. For example, outspoken and radical women can be accused of being un-African or Western when they speak out against and act on gender injustices. Nera Yuval Davis has been very insightful about that, and she states that many feminists from third world contexts confront voices that are eager to convert any feminist criticism they make of their culture into a mere symptom of the lack of respect for their culture, rooted in the westernization that they have caught like a disease. Yuval Davis's quotation raises two important concerns for the present. The one is whose culture is being referred to very often when people talk about betraying culture. And the other, of course, is whose feminism. Something that I think is often forgotten and ignored is that the notion of tradition and culture that's often used by many African leaders in third world contexts is defined, is a construct that's been defined by the colonialists. It's a racist construct, and it's one that fixates on the idea of Africans somehow being stuck in customs which they have a deep and irrational connection to. And of course, Yuval Davis also raises attention to the fact that feminism, as a body of ideas and actions that resist gender hierarchies and patriarchy, is usually defined as the possession of the West. As Yuval Davis also notes, tradition is used as a weapon against those who transgress the gender hierarchy and also heterosexuality as an institution which is linked to hierarchical gender roles. We see this in South Africa today in an organization like the Congress of Traditional South African Leaders, which is, for example, very supportive of virginity testing. It's anti-abortion, it's anti-homosexuality, and it equates feminism with a kind of a destructive westernization. I think it's also important to note that many African governments have a dual legal system where customary law and metropolitan law coexist. And of course, within customary law, women's rights are very often explicitly violated. In South Africa, the Constitution defends the right to culture, which includes practices that violate women's and girls' rights, at the same time that it disallows discrimination on the basis of gender. So you have this obvious contradiction. I think it's useful to say something about the virginity testing movement as an example of the way in which a fixed notion of culture and tradition has been used as a weapon against women. The examining of young women's hymens was a pre-colonial practice, but it's something that had started to decline by the 1980s. But towards the mid-90s, there was a dramatic upsurge of this practice at a time when traditional leaders were struggling to reassert their control. And of course, part of this reasserting of control was their control over the bodies of women, especially young girls. It's worth invoking the words of Jacob Zuma, the South African president here. Speaking as the head of the moral regeneration movement, Zuma said that in African custom, women valued their virginity, and that helped in keeping acceptable family values and self-respect for both young women and men. He said that girls knew that their virginity was their family's treasure, and boys respected that. They would only have sex when permitted to do so by their families after marriage, something which made them respect each other. So I think what I'd like to do now is open up for some discussion and questions. I've put some up. They're not necessarily ones that we need to focus on, but I think because culture, as I've said before, are focused on so centrally and are also so charged in debates about gender and feminism. For me, it's useful that we have some conversation around this.
Hello, it's Nick here.
Hi, Israel, and good morning, everybody. My name is Elaine Sala. Hi, Nick. I just wanted to intervene here and ask if there were any introduce myself as a facilitator, and to ask if there were any concerns or questions around clarification that we can raise now as well in relation to some of the questions that Desiree has put up.
What I'm going to be doing is taking presenter control away from Desiree. I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see a blank Word document. As questions are raised, I'm going to be copying and pasting them onto that so everyone can see, and then Desiree and Elaine can respond to the questions. Okay. Okay. If people would like to raise hands and ask questions using their raise question toolbar, I see Laura Washington has raised her hand. Please remember to focus these, target the questions at me, Nicholas Mulver, or globally, otherwise I might not be able to access them. Sorry, Wendell, can you access Laura's question? I see she has a question, but I cannot access it.
I can see that there is an unanswered question, but I'm not able to access it. Laura, would you be able to resend the question?
I'm still not able to access it,
I can
unfortunately.
see that Lourdes says sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. All right. Are there any
Okay, it is.
other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions.
Okay, Nick, yes, there's a question from Laura that says, Nicholas, please could the presenter comment on how Western feminisms perpetuate racist stereotypes of Africa? And she's also asking that we recognize people are using time to type the questions, so she's saying just give us a chance to type.
That's a very relevant point, Laura.
So should I, Desiree, are you there? Laura is asking how Western feminisms perpetuate racist stereotypes in Africa.
I find that the theorist who has written most interestingly about this is in fact a feminist based in the US, an Indian feminist. And she's written something called Under Western Eyes. And she basically enumerates the different stereotypes that are in place when Western feminists construct ideas about African women and actually generally women in the global South. The idea that they are always victims, the idea that they are passive and have no agency, the idea that they are somehow always linked to the domestic sphere, which is of course ridiculously paradoxical because many working African women are very much in the public sphere. And the image that I showed you, I think, captures that because we have this image of these women who seem very submissive, very servile, very accommodating, very inactive, huddled around their homes. And of course that distorts totally their lived realities. So I think there are a number of stereotypes, but many of them revolve around the idea of them being victims of their men, victims of violence, the idea of them not having the ability to act for themselves, having no agency, and that agency extends to their inability, their perceived inability to produce their own knowledge, to come up with their own solutions about what their problems are, about how their lives change. So in a nutshell, those are a few. There are a range, but I think those are probably the core ones.
Desiree, I see we have a question from Ingrid, which I've posted up. If you could attend to that as well, please.
The possibilities to change notions of culture, tradition as colonial and racist. I think one of the problems is that the understanding of culture and tradition that we have has been so heavily defined by colonial knowledge systems that it's very difficult to work out and to go back and to think about what really happened. Certain anthropologists have done this. And the African women anthropologists that I mentioned, Ifi Amadiume and Oyoronke Oyewumi, have tried to do this. Sometimes it runs the risk of romanticizing the past, so that someone like Ifi Amadiume, or actually really Oyoronke, almost tends to argue that there was no such thing as patriarchy in pre-colonial Africa. But I think it requires very, very careful anthropological work, and it requires also very careful interrogation of the existing traditions of anthropological work that have been done.
Thank you, Desiree. Let us wait for a little bit for any other questions that might come through. Once more, if I can just remind you to post it to me or the global audience.
Can I say something?
Certainly.
I'm just looking at, I'm just looking again at Ingrid's question, and I'm wondering if that was what she was asking.
Ingrid, if that didn't answer your question, you can always just send me another message and I'll post that up. I suspect that that might be good for the moment. Maybe a few more, maybe
Okay.
another minute or so, and then I will hand back to you, Desiree.
Okay.
Okay. I see Laura has asked a question. I still cannot access a question. I do not know why. Wendell, are you able to access Laura's question? Once more, let me apologize for these hiccups. As I said before, this is also a learning curve for the organizers. Okay, wait.
I think, Nick, I think Desiree should go on. Since we don't have any questions around this section, maybe Desiree, if you can continue with the rest of the presentation.
Okay. I've managed to access the questions. I have one from Laura. But just double check, was this the one that was, sorry, that was Ingrid Lynch. Did we answer the question from Laura, which stated, I think we also need to discuss the racist stereotypes of men that are perpetuated by Western feminisms, violent, hypersexual, deeply patriarchal, etc. Did we answer that question?
No, that question hasn't been answered. I've focused mainly on women. But yes, I agree. The racist stereotyping of men as hypersexual has somehow kind of burgeoned in the context of public health messaging around HIV/AIDS. So very often the idea is to depict black men as somehow not in control of their sexuality at all. And many of the interventions seem to focus on a process which is basically, sorry, there's some strange sound. Can people hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I
You might
just
just need
heard
to
drumming.
speak up. I think it's a little bit low.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying that these images basically support a process of almost launching civilization campaigns among men, rehabilitating men. That's the sort of subtext of a lot of the work with sort of high risk, what's deemed to be the high risk group of black men. So yes, the pathologizing of black men in terms of their violence, their hypersexuality is of course deeply disturbing. Generally, the black body has always been hypersexualized in colonialist thoughts. But I think we're seeing a resurgence of this even in popular culture. The idea of the gangster rapper. And it's become a very marketable figure. It's a icon. So it's certainly not a colonial stereotype that is gradually being disappeared. It's being developed in more and more complicated ways. I see another question. Hello? I'm not sure if anybody's hearing me.
No, we are.
Oh, okay. I see another question here from Tabiso. For me, culture poses challenges to feminism, to gender equality, but I don't see the example.
For example, polygamy. This is a cultural practice, but at whose expense?
I think, again, I want to stress that What is so disturbing is the very selective definition of what is cultural. So we find that many practices that are in fact harmful to women, oppressive to women, exploitative of women, are the practices that are seen to be needing to be defended. So I think what is important is for us to be very critical and to launch a critique on how
Hello, Desiree. Kendall, I think my internet connection has dropped. Can you still see? Can you still see my screen? Okay, and is Desiree still speaking? Elaine speaking. So you can other people hear you? Okay, my connection's been re-established. Also, Elaine is muted at the moment. Okay. Also, remind Elaine that was all that hammer we were hearing was Elaine typing with her mic on. Okay. Okay, no, that's fine. Can you see my screen?
construct of
Okay.
many feminists in the North. Hello?
Hello, sorry. It looks like there was a drop in the internet where I am, so that's why I suddenly went off. I do apologize.
There was a question from Daniela Cole, but I cannot see the question. It's not being typed up here. Nick, can you see Daniela's question?
If she could please, she says 1 moment. I don't think she's posted it yet. I apologize. As I said, there was a drop in the internet where I am, so I went off for a moment.
Okay.
Okay, Danielle says the conversation can carry on while she formulates her question.
Okay, Desiree, maybe Desiree should continue with some of the presentation while we wait for Daniela.
I did get a question from Ntombi Ngobise, which I'm going to post now. Can you see the question?
I think in our culture, power is controlled by the men. Yeah.
Okay, I think that...
Just the bottom of the question. There's just two words at the bottom that I'm not clear of. How do we think about feminism in terms of giving women power, help them to start questioning, not in a way of
Muted.
being part of decision making? I'm interested in the way that the question is posed because for me a crucial phrase there is not in a way of threatening culture. And I think it's important for us to really confront the fact that when we're talking about culture, we are not talking about something that is neutral. Culture is a site of power. Culture is the space where we acquire identities, gender socialization. So we inevitably, if we are going to challenge gender relations and gender roles, we are going to be challenging aspects of our culture. I think in South Africa, because cultures associated with black people have been so denigrated by racism, we often feel that we have to defend a way of life or culture because it's been subjected to, it's been threatened by racism. But I think we also need to accept that if we want to be critical of gender injustices, we also need to be critical of culture.
But Desiree, can I ask you also, because I think Ntombi is raising another key burning issue that a lot of women face, which is about holding on to a specific cultural identity at the same time challenging issues of gender power within that specific community. So could you speak a little to that and, you know, and maybe speak to the issues of the dynamism that you referred to earlier?
Yeah, what I was saying is that it's important for us to think about how we can rewrite cultural histories, rewrite cultural histories and redefine them in ways that take into account the fact that they have not always been hyper-patriarchal. They have not always been systems where men exercise absolute control over women. And I think that the whole process of unearthing and excavating legacies of women, whether as individuals or women in groups, who have had agency, who have had power, is important in that redefinition. And I think, I mean, when you speak about, I think it's also important, Elaine, even when we speak about cultural identities, it's so important that these cultural identities also have not always simply been there. They come from somewhere. And I think in South Africa we so badly need to hang on to the categories that we know. So while I realize that there's a strong emotional and political investment in cultural identities, I think it's also important for us to start to question them at the same time that we question the other sorts of social problems and issues that trouble us.
Okay. Thanks, Desiree. We have another question by Daniela Coleman. Why are we focusing so much on the binaries of Western feminism versus feminism dwelling in the global South or versus African feminisms? And she refers to the diversification of feminisms within Africa And she asked, why can we not further explore these feminisms in the context of culture, tradition, power, etc.? In addition, we are here at SWET with society members, and I think she's probably making reference to these diverse issues that different organizations are taking on at grassroots. So could you, it relates very nicely to inform this question as well, you know, the issues around the local power struggles, gender power struggles.
I started off by raising the dualism, the binary of Western and African or feminisms in the global South, because I think this is the way in which we need to think about the context in which the notion of tradition is usually deployed. So it is where I started, and I do want to move on to thinking about diverse feminisms and the way in which feminisms, especially in Africa, have intersected with other power relations. I agree, there is a diversity of African feminism. So yes, I think we definitely explore these, and hopefully you'll have another comment when we do go on to do so.
Okay, I don't see any further hands up around this issue. Desiree, can I ask you to continue with your PowerPoint? Oh, we've got a question from Sama Dia, but we'll wait for that question to come up. I think I see it here. Could you please comment on the influence of culture and socialization on the current challenges that the gender sector is facing in terms of raising money for feminist organizations to take charge of their own struggles for freedom? So she's clearly asking a very pertinent question in relation to funding and sustainability of feminist organizations.
This is something to do later on, but I think generally what has been happening is that NGOs and organizations have been under a great deal of pressure from donors. And at the moment, donors believe that South Africa is not that much in need of funds. So NGOs are in a kind of a double bind where they are almost having to placate the donors by following their agendas, even though they might believe that the realities on the ground require different strategies and different agendas. So it's something that all NGOs are facing. And I think your question is that your feeling is that what should be a priority is socialization. And I think so often the NGOs are concerned with processes that are less broad and less complex. So, for example, empowering women in relation to particular tasks or training women for particular activities seems to be much more manageable. Whereas I think you're correctly identifying the fact that processes of socialization are crucial, and that is where intervention really needs to come. But it's very difficult, I think, to get donors interested in that.
Sima has another comment. It says, I agree that funders are moving to other African countries. However, more and more men's organizations working on gender are getting more funding to fight for women. So I guess she's asking you to comment on the donors' agendas and who sets the agenda for NGOs and CBOs.
Absolutely. I agree totally that the shift in funding towards men's organizations is profoundly disturbing. And it's in line with the kind of a public health message and a belief that the salient social problem in South Africa right now is to deal with the problem of HIV/AIDS and, secondly, violence. And the solution, the short-term solution, according to the donors, is to rehabilitate the men, work with men's organizations, work with men on taking sexual responsibility for their sexuality. It's a really short-term solution because very often within these organizations there are very little shifts in consciousness that do occur. Ideally, it makes more sense, obviously, to work and build a strong feminist movement, work with women's organizations so that one creates a context in which men can then respond to. So again, it's very symptomatic of the donors' idea of how things change. You throw money at something and you have quick fix solutions, you train men and they come out better men and all will be solved. So it is a very disturbing problem and it's very symptomatic of how agendas are set by donors.
Desiree, can I ask you, given that comment, this is just the build-up on Sami's question, should women be organizing independently and regardless of donor themes and agendas?
I would say most definitely. You're saying should there be a strong civil society organization which is not dependent on donor organizations? Most definitely, because that is when you have the freedom to set your own agendas and you're not constrained by donor directives. The problem is that it is very, very difficult, especially right now. Women in civil society are extremely stretched, and many CBOs have, of course, relied on donor funding to a certain extent to run some of their basic operations, and even this money is no longer coming in. So it's very, very hard. Politically, it gives one the most freedom, but practically, it's the most challenging route.
Okay, thanks for that, Desiree. I don't see any other hands up here, so I'm looking at time, and I'm thinking possibly could you go on with your presentation then with reference to the PowerPoint. Nick, is there any way we can have the PowerPoint up on the screen again, please?
Yes, I'm transferring presenter control to Desiree now.
Oh, we've got enough. Okay, before you do that, we do have another question, Desiree. And this is from
Muted.
It says, although a largely unrecorded and uncelebrated history of feminisms predate Africa's contact with the West, contemporary feminist politics is rooted in political activism.
Sorry, Elaine.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, that's my PowerPoint.
Oh, that's your PowerPoint. Oops. Sorry. It's sitting with 3 screens in front of me.
I know. It must be very confusing.
Oh, oops.
Yeah.
I'm not. Okay. Mpume is probably typing. But possibly could you go on and we'll take Mpume's question after the presentation of the next section.
Okay.
Mpume, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Okay, I want to move now on to nationalism and feminism before moving on to the post-colonial period. So just to summarize, although a largely unrecorded and uncelebrated history of feminism predates Africa's contact with the West, contemporary feminist politics is rooted in political activity and organizations established during colonialism. So that we can trace the politics that we see today to the anti-colonial, anti-racist, and nationalist movements. Many of the present forms of feminist activism, including organizations and strategies in Africa, started with women's involvement in nationalism. Of course, many believe that African nationalism was driven mainly by westernized men, but women were centrally involved, for example, in trade unions, in boycotts, in community activism, and various rebellions. In fact, nationalist movements relied on the mobilization, leadership, and political vision of women in grassroots organizations. And the active roles led them to take up very influential roles. Now, there have been ongoing debates about whether women's participation in nationalism has been empowering for them or has reinforced their subordination and their prescribed roles. Some argue that when women are involved in anti-racist and nationalist struggles, they always play merely supportive roles as mothers, wives, caregivers, and supporters of the men in their communities. In playing these roles, so the argument goes, they are not addressing gender inequalities and injustices at all. In other words, the belief is that women's involvement in nationalism is always anti-feminist or non-feminist. Certain South African commentators have referred to this as motherism and not feminism. Others argue differently. They believe that women involved in nationalist, anti-racist, or anti-colonial struggles develop leadership skills, militancy, and assertiveness that affects their understanding of gender. Women who are involved in anti-racist, anti-colonial struggles learn to think about themselves as active and independent agents. Whether they define themselves as feminist or not, they acquire an assertive political consciousness about power, injustice, and resistance at different levels. Now, someone for me who's written about this very interestingly is Mania Lazreg, who's dealt with Algerian women involved in anti-colonialism. And her conclusion is that revolutions against hunger, unemployment, poverty, and political discrimination are necessarily revolutions in structures of consciousness. In other words, she argues that it's ridiculous to think about women's involvement in nationalist struggles as being somehow anti-feminist. There's a kind of shift going on in terms of consciousness, in terms of self-perception, in terms of agency. And that is certainly a form of feminist, a kind of a feminist shift. A question that I want to pose here is, has women's involvement meant choosing between nationalism on one hand, nationalism or communal struggles on one hand, and feminism on the other? This has sometimes been the case. When women have had to demonstrate racial, national, or class unity despite stark gender injustices within these communities. Within anti-colonial or anti-racist movements, they've been made to feel that breaking silences about gender injustices constitutes betrayal. Many movements have also advocated two-stage revolutions, and the belief is that gender inequalities need to be addressed after the bigger picture. Now, I'm just referring here to mentioning a text that I find very useful. It's a book called Women in the Zimbabwean Liberation Struggle, and I find it particularly interesting because it captures the voices of women themselves and their sense of very often their contradictions and how torn they have often felt in being involved in nationalist struggles where they are so acutely aware that gender is a constant problem, including violence against women. I just want to summarize some points here. What important lessons does women's participation in nationalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and class struggles teach us? First of all, many women. Secondly, patriarchy cannot be disconnected from other oppressive systems such as racist systems, colonialism, neo-imperial, and class systems. Thirdly, women are often involved in different struggles, which sometimes intersect and sometimes do not. Fourthly, judging women's levels of consciousness without taking into account their multiple struggles leads to certain dominant feminist views being used to measure others. And this leads me to make some reflections on women, difference, and feminism in Africa. Many radical women within groups discriminated on the basis of race or class develop a powerful sense of their difference from white, middle class, or Western feminism. For example, in South Africa, radical black women, especially in the 1990s, spoke out increasingly about the prescriptivism of white feminists and race blindness of white feminists. They insisted that black women had unique experiences of marginalization, which included being defined as white feminist research subjects. Elsewhere in Africa, Radical women such as Malara Ogundipe Leslie and Philomena Steady have used terms such as womanism and Stewanism to indicate the context of their feminism, especially the extent to which class, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist struggles intersect with feminist struggles. And I've mentioned it before, but I want to turn to it again now. Chandramanti's important essay, Under Western Eyes, describes the problematic way in which Western feminism stereotypes the experiences of women in the Third World and assumes that they need to be developed and uplifted in accordance with Western feminist goals. Mohanty wrote this essay in the 1980s, but today globally we are seeing a resurgence of Western-centric feminism. The global South is being defined as those housing those in need of salvation from poverty, HIV/AIDS, violence, and of course the humanitarian organizations in the North are very well funded. There's a very lucrative rights industry. And I'm including this image because this is the kind of image and text, again conveying ideas about simple, helpless, overburdened African people, which is continuing to play a central role in ostensibly feminist interventions, often driven by donors and rights organizations in the North. Esther Eisenstein, who is an American, in her book Feminism Seduced, shows how feminism in North America is being used as a weapon in the war on terror, where women in the Middle East are being defined as the needy victims of their patriarchal cultures, victims who can be saved only by the intervention of the West. Similar arguments have been made about gays and lesbians in Palestine. In fact, Israel is currently pouring numerous resources, especially producing films, into defining itself as a haven for Palestinian gays and lesbians who are seen to be persecuted by their culture. So what I'm saying is that it's important to dwell on, someone asked me before why I was focusing on Western centricism. It's important to dwell on these dynamics, to confront the ways in which Western-centric and colonialist ideas about feminism repeatedly function as adjuncts of imperial power rather than as the allies of women or sexual minorities in the South. And of course, because resources are located in the North, this is often where NGOs and people and groupings in the South turn to resources, but also very often adopt their vision as well. Okay, I just want to say something quickly about the term intersectionality. The term intersectionality, and more recently assemblage, is used to capture intersecting identities and struggles, especially for feminists. So that decades after most African women's participation in nationalism in the 1960s, many feminists today realize that feminism can't be conceptualized in isolation from other struggles, that there are in fact different feminisms. And the challenge for feminist collaborations rests on dialogue through transnational feminism and strategic alliances, rather than on particular feminists prescribing to others. Okay, I want to move now into a question and discussion stage, if there are any questions. I put some up, but of course these are just guides. So can we see if there are any comments or questions?
Okay, Des, thanks for that. We'll pick up on Pumi's question now, but at the same time, can I ask you just to speak a little louder and into the mic, because I think some people might be having problems with sound clarity.
Oh, okay.
Pumi has asked, can we have, she's picking up on Sima's earlier question, to ask you to whether there is any positive feminism without male involvement. Can you have a positive feminist movement, I guess, without male involvement?
I think it's useful for one to start by having an understanding of what feminism is. Of course, there are very many feminisms, but many would argue that feminism revolves around acknowledging and recognizing the silenced and marginalized positions of women. And central to recognizing those silenced and marginalized positions is for women to be able to have the space, the opportunity to speak, to hear themselves and to listen to each other. Even if one thinks in a very practical way of having, I recently attended a meeting it was given by a South African feminist. And the first people to put their hands up were men. And they took over the space. And I think what we have to realize is that men are socialized in a particular way. This is not to pathologize all men, but men are socialized in a particular way, in the same way that women have been socialized in a particular way. So part of feminism's aim is to question and break down that process of socialization, to break down the hierarchy which allows men to feel a sense of entitlement, to feel a sense of superiority. So I would say that there will not be any positive feminist movement with male involvement rather than without male involvement.
Okay, thanks for that. We also have a question from Laura Washington. While we wait for that to be uploaded, maybe we will get you to speak a little to your questions as well. And if other people have questions or clarification regarding Desiree's earlier presentation, please, now's the time to voice those questions. I'm looking for Laura's question. I don't see it here, but so I'm waiting for that question to appear on the screen. But while we are at that, Desiree, I'm wondering, would it be helpful to also, given your inferences to how marginalized gender groupings get incorporated into these complicated, you made very powerful reference to lesbian and gays in Palestine. How does one, how do various gendered subjugated groups incorporate that consciousness into their discussions, activities, while still raising their very legitimate claims to rights within marginal communities?
I think the question that you're asking is it possible to develop a critique of racism and imperialism within, say, for example, the LGBT movement at the same time that one is very aware of the need to struggle for rights? Is that more or less what you're asking?
That's part of it, and it also would look up, obviously, to your issue around intersectionality, your use of terms like intersectionality.
Yeah. I would say that it is absolutely important to engage in a sustained critique of racism, colonialism, neo-imperialism at the same time that one is engaging in struggles around sexual rights, gender justice. And just to reinforce what I said about intersectionality, to acknowledge that struggles are multiple, struggles are complex. And I think very often the belief is that if you take on too much, you are neglecting one. But struggles are never experienced in terms of layers. And I think if you think about the idea of intersectionality, it's quite tempting to think about struggles somehow being layered. So you have class, you have gender, you have race. but that's not actually how we experience our lives. That's not how we experience our identities. These different aspects of our identities are interlinked and some are embedded within each other. So these struggles, if one is thinking about struggles for freedom, one has to engage these struggles at different levels. And I think feminists have done that fairly successfully. And the feminist engagement with both colonialism and racism and patriarchy has been a very lively one. But I think it's only more recently that queer of color theorists have started to look critically at the problems of racial and imperial dominance in the lesbian and gay movement in the global south.
Okay, thanks for that, Desiree. I'm looking for Laura's question still, but I don't see it here. Nick, can you be of assistance? Hello, Nick. I'm asking for assistance. I don't see Laura's question here.
Elaine, I think Laura's having problems with her sound. So Nick,
oh, okay.
Elaine, I think Laura's having with her sound.
Okay. Okay, well, since there aren't any other hands raised, yeah, I don't see any other hands raised. Desiree, maybe you wanted to pick up and continue with your PowerPoint presentation?
Okay.
We've got a question from Danielle Coleman. Before you continue, I'm waiting for that question to be typed up and appear on the screen. And Vanessa, here's an earlier question from Vanessa Ludwig as well. That wasn't, I don't think, was answered. Vanessa says, because that's, I'm going to look at Vanessa's question because I don't see Daniel's Coleman's question coming up. Vanessa says it might be a comment. We only have to look back at the Kalmahi River Collective statement in the 70s to understand how feminism has understood the intersectionalities of oppressions and sought answers on how to address multiple forms of discrimination without creating hierarchies of oppression. Desiree, can you comment on that comment in relation to this presentation about all these multiple forms of power that you refer to in terms of the layering of oppressions? Desiree, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I was muted for a second. I think that Vanessa's was an example, and it does illustrate that definitely when one integrates struggles, it's not, struggles become so much more focused, and that it's actually when you artificially try and tease out certain aspects of struggle, that's where the problem starts. If one is in an experience where you are confronted with the realities of multiple forms of injustice, in order to pursue freedom, you do have to deal with them all simultaneously. And I think Vanessa's example was very compelling.
Okay. Thanks for that, Desiree. I'm looking for Danielle and Laura's question. I don't see it here.
trying to see how
it's not coming up on the questions pane. Danielle? Okay, Wendell's just assisting me. Oh, hallelujah. I've been sitting here with the tiny, tiny questions pane. Thanks, Wendell. Okay. Okay, Danielle, she's still formulating her question. Okay, she says the conversation can continue. So, Desiree, if you want to, you can continue with your PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay, I'm moving on to the post-independence period. After independence, many women became aware of the need to squarely confront gendered injustices and the patriarchal nature of the new post-colonial states. The largest women's organizations tended to be the women's wings attached to the ruling parties, and it became clear that these often supported the new government in power, and that these governments remained male-dominated and insensitive to gender injustices. Provisions for challenging gender inequalities in South Africa were set in place before the fall of apartheid. One reason is that South African progressives had learned from struggles in other countries. The other reason is that the long history of gender activism among women during the anti-apartheid struggle anticipated gender transformation before the drafting of the post-apartheid constitution. From the late 1980s, activists acknowledged that gender activism had to be woven into other forms of political activism and the broader battle against apartheid. It was realized that gender had a distinct dynamic and that it was important to focus on gender politics and justice in spheres ranging from domestic and family life to structures and relations within anti-apartheid movements and trade unions. And of course, also the United Democratic Front, African National Congress, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Okay, the post-independence phase in all African countries was characterized by self-conscious and explicit engagement with gender transformation and feminism. However, post-apartheid and post-colonial feminist strategies have been very different, and they have had different effects. It's also debatable whether many of these could be called feminist. So how can we outline these and identify challenges for today? I'm starting off by talking about liberal strategies, since these have been used very often in many NGOs, certainly in government. So I think it's important for us to think about exactly what liberal strategies involve and what their pitfalls are. Measures have included affirmative action policies and legislation for ensuring women's rights. In practice, however, these strategies present several problems and have made little headway in creating meaningful gender transformation in the society as a whole, or in bettering many women's lives. In an article titled Rights and Realities, which is published in Third World Quarterly, the South African feminist Mary Hames argues that paper rights for women in South Africa have not been translated into substantive rights. Sorry. Oh no, I've got lost.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. Take your time.
Okay. Can you move this around for me now? Okay. Government-led strategies, which often draw on liberal strategies. Governments have not spoken with a single voice in pursuing gender transformation, and many individuals and groups have been more progressive than others. In South Africa, many who drove gender transformation before the fall of apartheid took up positions in government to drive further democratic process. But government strategies, both in South Africa and elsewhere, have had limited success. One reason is that policies and legislation have not been implemented in a sustained and holistic way. African governments tend to have extensive mechanisms for driving gender transformation: national machinery, women's ministries, gender desks, or gender commissions. These, however, often have very little clout and very little autonomy. The main problem here is that they often function for government rather than for women or civil society, and have little space in which to support issues and concerns expressed within civil society.
Okay, Desiree, can I ask you, can we pause for just a moment? We've got a question. We've got some questions in relation to the issue about paper rights and substantive rights, especially given the debates now currently about sex work and legalizing sex work. There are questions from Daniela Coleman, and she says, as we discuss the contradictions within feminism, many feminists believe that sex work is considered severe oppression under the guise of a patriarchal system. How does a sex worker feminist begin to challenge other feminists when it comes to recognizing sex work as work? So I think it's an important issue in relation to, whose rights on paper, but also the expansion of which collectives of women's substantive rights. And I think Daniela's question relates specifically to this issue because I know that it's something that I've been struggling with myself, especially in relation to a Facebook conversation with Sally Shackleton and Nosizwe Madlala Ratledge. So do you think you can comment on Daniela's question about how do women doing sex work challenge other feminists when it comes to recognizing sex work as work? Because it seems to complicate a whole set of issues around bodily integrity, bodily and reproductive rights, work, and the notions of work.
I think we also have to accept, Elaine, that feminists are not all agreed in how they define sex work. So, I'm not quite sure what the question...
I think Daniela's trying to say, well, if a sex worker feminist demands and insists upon the right that sex is work, some of the aspects of modernizing discourses amongst feminists that will not accept sex work as work. So what are the conversations possibly that need to be had here, both in terms of intersectionalities and notions of work and bodily integrity?
I think for me, the conversations that would have to be had would probably not be moralizing if we are talking about feminists. I think that they would be very hard political questions, which would revolve around thinking about the context of sex work, because sex work doesn't take place in a vacuum. Sex work takes place in very particular contexts. And we need to think about questions of choice. I think so often the matter of choice is then dealt with in two-dimensional terms. You either choose to be a sex worker or you don't. So I agree with you. There are some very hard and difficult conversations that need to be had about questions of agency and choice in relation to sex work. But I don't think that these are moral conversations. I don't know if those kinds of debates have been happening, because I think so far the discussion has focused on, either one thinks about choice or one thinks about victimization. And it's so much more complicated than that. but I think it's certainly a topic for feminists to spend a lot of careful thought on.
This is clearly a conversation, Daniela, that I think SWET needs to lead. But it's a debate to be had amongst feminist organizations, but in a safe and closed context, which is not open to judgment. But I think feminists also hear each other.
Yeah.
Nick, is there any way, I'm wondering if Daniela Coleman wants to come in. Is there any way we could unmute? Daniela, do I have that right?
You're unmuted. Sorry.
Okay, thank you all for addressing that question. And I guess we really just wanted to kind of throw a wrench into the conversation to make sure that all women were going to be, represented as we do discuss feminism. And we definitely agree when you say that there are some hard questions that we need to discuss within the feminist context in more of a closed and safe space. And we did actually last year have a seminar where we talked about sex work and feminism, where we really delved into these topics. But I think you guys actually already expressed what we were going to say, which was within the feminist discourse, we really do need to discuss, again, forms of oppression and victimization and agency and autonomy, and who gets to have that, and how Western feminism contextualizes those topics, and again, who gets to have that autonomy and that agency. And so we appreciate the
So Daniela, with respect, I think SWET needs to continue this engagement. Possibly we can think of another webinar conversation around this specific issue, because it's a hard but necessary issue that we address. And so certainly from Glenise, Wendell, Renee, I think this is an important issue to be taken up post the series of webinars, or another webinar focused specifically on this issue. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Daniel.
I see Ingrid Lynch's hand's been up, but I don't see Ingrid's question. Okay, I'm looking for Ingrid's question. I don't see it here. While I wait for that, if you forgive the interruptions, Desiree, maybe you should go on.
Okay. I've spoken about NGOs before, but let me just go back to some points. Yeah, international donors often prescribe goals for NGOs in countries in the global south, so that NGOs are under pressure to comply with donors' agendas and can lose sight of struggles on the ground. The disconnect between NGO goals and strategies and those of women can intensify when donors reduce their funding. In order to obtain funding, NGOs may end up compromising on actual lived realities more and more. Donors also focus on countries who are seen to be most in need of, more in need of transformation than others. And this has become a particular problem in present-day South Africa, where NGOs are under considerable economic pressure because they are receiving far less support than donors than before. And the tendency to be donor-driven rather than sensitive to civil society intensifies. Turning to CBOs and civil society, because community-based organizations are far less dependent on funding and are driven by communities, they are theoretically less constrained and have more autonomy to define and shape their own struggles. Even CBOs draw on external funds for supporting the operations and the permanent staff that they may require. Also, the women working in CBOs in many parts of Africa today are enormously stretched, struggling to shoulder numerous commitments in a context where African states have become more and more neoliberal. In other words, they have handed over the responsibility to citizens in terms of financial support, healthcare, service provision, and have replaced state support with multinational capitalist penetration. through structural adjustment programs, and in South Africa, GEAR. So it's often CBOs and feminists in civil society who face and respond to the multiple challenges that women face. But at the same time, they often find it hardest to sustain themselves. I want to turn now to intellectual activism in universities and think about what role feminism in universities seems to be playing. I think it would be true to say that the 1990s was an exciting decade for feminism in African universities, and that includes South Africa. Numerous departments and networks were set up to strengthen initiatives that had begun in previous years. Most of the departments and centers that still exist were launched during this decade. Increasingly, though, feminist intellectual activism has become less connected to feminist activism. The reasons for this have much to do with decreasing financial support for African universities and the humanities and social sciences in particular. Charmaine Pereira, a Nigerian feminist, notes that many African sites of gender research and teaching are functioning to service the state. Regarding research, many researchers work as consultants to provide information and policy-related work. Oh, that doesn't make sense. And often piecemeal strategies for gender transformation. As Pat McFadden has shown, being a gender expert has been a lucrative business for many. And because gender experts are expected to produce quick fix results, and also results that accommodate the status quo, there is little space for critical work on power. Regarding teaching, much teaching has become increasingly technicist, with students being prepared to use concepts and methodologies in the service of developmentalist projects, rather than in the service of critical explorations of power. A second concern is the growing specialization of feminist research at universities. Feminist research and teaching in Africa emerges out of a climate of quite rigorously questioning social and personal relations and identities, pushing back the boundaries around values and concepts that are quite authoritarian and restrictive. In recent years, however, more emphasis is placed on the directly functional value of work that directly prepares students for instrumental roles rather than critical participation. Barbara Christian, writing about a North American context, identifies the connected trends of what she calls commoditization and professionalism that have worked to depoliticize feminist scholarship. She notes that by the 90s, much feminist theory had become a commodity which helped to determine whether we were hired or promoted in academic institutions. She concludes that the elevation of mainstream notions of professionalism certainly replaced the preoccupation with politics for many feminist academics. And the new context is a highly competitive one in which academics are rewarded through the offer of tenure, promotion, or project funding for personal research, teaching relief, and postgraduate students. So the trend towards professionalism and skills training in much academic feminism means that earlier forms of solidarity and communication between feminist academics and feminist activists have become far less common than was formerly the case. While many feminists in universities continue to nurture networks with feminist activists, a number have retreated increasingly into professionalism. I'm wondering whether I should stop now are there any questions or comments at this stage? Because I wanted to move on to raise some challenges for feminism today.
I think it's a good time to just break for a minute, pause, get some questions. But we do have a question from Ingrid that I couldn't see earlier, that hooks up to Danielle's question. And the question is quite pertinent, where she asks, can a modelizing argument against sex work be regarded as feminist?
Can an argument be regarded as feminist?
Against sex work be And we've got
Okay.
now the challenges of feminism in Africa today. In fact, we've already started addressing some of these issues.
Oh, yes.
So,
Yeah.
so maybe continue and finish off, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes or so for open discussion and questions.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to try and rush through this so that we can have some time at the end. At a recent seminar at the African Gender Institute, the feminist and public intellectual Pumla Gola raised the challenge for South African feminists to feminist differently. One of the main... Something terrible happening to my ears. I don't know if it's happening to other people as well. One of the main I'm just waiting for the sound to die down because I'm not sure if it's affecting other people. Elaine?
It did affect me, but it has died down now.
Has it died down? Okay. One of the main concerns was that gender activists and feminists have been too accommodative of the patriarchal, governmental, and capitalist status quo. The status quo has been concealed by window dressing, and it is time, she implied, that the window dressing were exposed. Focusing especially on growing rates of violence against women, she raised the need for feminists to be far more outspoken and uncompromising in critiquing violent masculinities and the normalizing of gender identities and roles in our societies. She recommended greater radicalism in how we critique the institutions that actually nurture violent masculinities through, for example, heterosexuality. In South Africa, then, rather than assuming that acts of violence against women are the result of the bizarre behavior of particular individuals, we need to squarely confront how our society's institutions and cultural practices, through, for example, the mass media, gangster rap, or contact sport, actively promote and applaud violent performances of masculinity. This was really brought home to me when at the start of the year, I saw these posters advertising rugby all over campus. And they had the most ridiculously stereotypical images of women in bathing suits sort of applauding these men. And these are the naturalized images of women in relation to men, which actually feed into forms of misogyny. And I think very often we just don't take seriously enough those insidious forms of socialization that we often see in the media, including at university campuses. This kind of attention to embedded patriarchal structures, institutions, and ideologies means that we can't soft pedal our feminism. We cannot, for example, argue that our governments are still in transition and that gender transformation will have to take more time, or that nation building requires a concerted national effort, so our claims will have to be more moderate and we should take a back seat while bigger battles are fought. We also simply can't afford to be duped by our governments. Equally importantly, we can't assume that women in government will be feminists. Positions in the state are positions of power, and women who hold those positions will not compromise their own positions of privilege and their own power. I just wanted to say something about some of the concepts that are trotted out in the name of feminism that I am very uncomfortable with. One approach to gender transformation is through sectoralism. Yeah, and I find that it's one of the pitfalls of current work on gender, especially within government. And it's the belief that gender oppression and discrimination can be addressed in isolation from other social injustices, for example, class inequality, unemployment, homelessness, neoliberalism. The problem is that gendered subjects, women and men, are always situated in contexts shaped by different struggles. These always affect their gendered experiences. Trying to separate work on gender into gender sectors is therefore futile. It creates artificial solutions on the basis of artificial and unreal people. The women that I imagine through a sectoral approach might look very good in policy reports and plans, but they simply do not exist in reality.
Desiree, can I stop you there for a minute?
Yeah,
Because there's quite an important query as an intervention. Karen Pillay has asked that given these concerns and given that activists are sitting on the ground well aware of interconnectedness, but also the request for prioritizing issues, um, can activists and civil society influence NGOs' funding and donor strategies? Or should we just cast aside donor funding and strategies overboard? Because donors do come and ask questions about what are priorities for re-strategizing the agenda and the funding of gender work. How can we put pressure on donors? And I think that, Karin, thanks for that question. It's a key question that I think a lot of CBOs and NGOs sit with as well. Yes?
I think it's absolutely crucial to put pressure on donors. I think very often the assumption is that, well, because we're getting money, we dare not question and we dare not criticize. Last year I attended quite an interesting meeting involving HIVOS and a range of various academics and activists. And the aim was to open up a space for HIVOS to hear people talking about the needs for thinking about intervention into sexual rights. So I think, I mean, HIVOS is probably a particularly receptive donor. But I think it is important to put pressure, and we do need to believe that we have the power to put pressure on donors, because it seems as if they've assumed that they have the right to decide for us. And I think it really is up to NGOs to play a much more central role in deciding what needs to be done.
Okay, thanks for that, Desiree. I have asked for Karen if she wants to be unmuted, but in the meantime, if you could go on, and then we'll bring on Karen later on if she will answer this question.
Okay. I will say something about mainstreaming. Somebody that I find very interesting on this is a woman called Sunila Abayasekera. And her paper is online, and she argues that since Beijing, gender mainstreaming has become a concept that one finds reflected in almost all the documents emanating from international donor agencies and financial institutions. Donor agencies, in turn, have promoted the concept within their organizations as well as within the organizations and institutions they support in aid-receiving countries. But she shows that gender mainstream actually originally had very radical and disruptive meanings. She says, when we first talked about mainstreaming, we did it from the point of view that there was a need to take into consideration the differences between men and women in their ability to enjoy human rights. Thus, we maintained an inclusive approach while at the same time being very clear that there are woman-specific violations of human rights. She goes on to argue that mainstreaming now has become very conservative. Presently, gender mainstreaming has little to do with social transformation and everything to do with women's absorption into existing class, gendered, heteronormative, and imperialistic systems. The redefinition of feminist discourse by neoliberalism has meant that gender mainstreaming means something very much like the women in development paradigm. In other words, ensuring that marginalized women become productive within the global capitalist system, and not that the patriarchal global capitalist system be challenged by their needs. So I suppose what I'm reasserting there is the importance of feminism, which takes into account multiple struggles, and a moving away from this idea that gender can be dealt with in isolation through kind of strategies that are packaged as mainstreaming. I want to raise this, LGBTI struggles and feminism, because it's an area that feminists seem to not think about, and for me it's a space for very important collaboration. In many African countries, there's been a long history of separating the struggles of gays and lesbians from feminist struggles. This has occurred despite the fact that the coercing of heterosexuality is deeply gendered, and homophobia is very much a gender-related issue. Heterosexuality is a site for confirming prescribed gender relations, and when sexual orientation is policed, it is done so in the name of ensuring that men and women behave as proper men and women. Struggles for sexual rights in many African countries are at present high on the agenda. While activists and certain academics have been outspoken on this issue, it's discouraging that many feminists continue to focus on gender in isolation from radical explorations of sexuality and assume that this is best dealt with by LGBTI activists. Sylvia Tamale's involvement in LGBT struggles in Uganda is an inspiring exception, of course. At the same time, many LGBTI activists, for example in South Africa and Uganda, have tended to work in isolation from feminists and feminist politics. The result has been a narrow focus on rights in the absence of a more holistic understanding of the institutions, prejudices, stereotypes that regulate gender and sexuality, and how we can free ourselves from these. An important challenge for feminists and LGBTI activists then is to strategize about bridging the divide and develop self-centered perspectives on LGBTI struggles, in similar ways to the efforts of feminists to develop post-colonial and African-centered feminist strategies. The LGBTI rights struggles in Africa often take their cue from human rights organizations in the North. Feminists in the South, who have long struggled with problems of universalizing struggles and the dominance of Western feminism, could play a very significant role. I wanted to end off by saying something very brief about getting back to Dola's point about feministing differently. And I've been thinking more and more about younger feminists. Patricia Hill Collins, the African-American feminist, has referred to a hip-hop generation of feminists. And she talks about the way that young women are using new platforms in media, such as performance and poetry, to develop new forms of consciousness in a rapidly changing world. I've recently become more interested in the way that ICTs can also play a central role. What I find discouraging is that a lot of the work on ICTs and gender transformation, there's very little work, I think, in Africa on ICTs and feminism. There's a lot on ICTs and women, ICTs and gender. A lot of it doesn't really focus on feminist visions and feminist transformation. A lot of it focuses on kind of women's short-term empowerment through, for example, enhancing their powers as business people. So for me, what seems to be a huge possibility is how ICTs can be used, especially among a younger generation of feminists. At a moment when feminism faces the challenge of being watered down rights-based agendas or co-opted by the state, digital technologies and the internet provide very encouraging opportunities. For older feminists like myself, the challenge is to overcome cynicism, disinterest, and in many cases fear of the new technologies. But working with existing organizations and networks of young women, experienced feminists would be able to embrace their potential to trouble the status quo, to mentor young feminists, and to learn a lot from them. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, Desiree, thank you so very much for this presentation. We still have a number of questions. We've got about 10 minutes. I feel like someone in a lot of absolute control, because it's weird. People are all not are muted, but we will be unmuting everybody after 2 questions are answered. We've got a question from Laura Washington, who is from Project Empower. She says, I think we need to remember that northern capitalist governments are the back donors of all NGOs. Our experience is as an NGO that we are not consulted about shifting agendas, but rather told in nice ways or not. This is not surprising, given the ultimate neoliberal and perhaps pacifying agenda of the donor agencies. That's Lord Washington's comment. Do you want to respond to that, Des?
I think it's, I mean, I said before, it is important to speak to donors, but I suppose there are certain donors that one can speak to, and Hivas is an example. But the bottom line is that donors are part of a global system.